So we are recording. My name's Paul Humphreys. This is Rheophilia interviews in freshwater, but also in other types of aquatic sciences and many other things, as we'll see today. And my my guest today is Professor Emerita at University of Technology Sydney, Heather Goodall, who's an environmental historian and the author and researcher of many things, as I've learned as I've done my own research about her history, the history of her research. Something's beeping. Is that me beeping?
No, I'm afraid it's me. I can't actually turn that off.
That's all right. That's okay.
I don't know how.
That's the nature of these sort of things. So welcome, Heather. Thanks very much for talking to me today. It's very nice to have you here. So Heather and I just fill people in. Heather and I sort of first started corresponding a while ago because I was interested in some of the research that she was doing and had done in the past in my own, as part of my own research in writing a book about Murray cod, and she's very gracious in helping me out with quite a few things. But look, let's go back to the beginning. I'm always curious about how people get involved in the topics and subjects, disciplines that they get into. And you did your undergraduate at the University of Sydney, and you did honours in history at University of Sydney. So where's the love of history come from in the first place?
Oh, the love of history absolutely comes from my mother. She was a great storyteller, and she was interested in family history. She was interested in stories of past experience, and she encouraged my reading of anything, but she was particularly interested in historical novels, and she just enjoyed history. So she enjoyed the work that I was doing. I actually began my university career with the intention of becoming a doctor. I started in medicine, and I did a couple of years in medicine, and I had already really become interested in history and languages or English in high school. And I transferred. I realised that medicine was such an all-consuming profession that I'd lose my opportunities to do the things that I enjoyed. So I transferred, and I became. I went into the arts faculty, and I really became interested in historical work. And the work that I really enjoyed was with Bob Dreyer, particularly cultural history, and with Jim Massalos, working in social history of India. So I learnt a fair bit about Indian nationalism and a lot about Bombay, which was Jim's focal area. And then I was interested already in Australian politics, and I was involved in the Aboriginal support movement. And I was meeting people, and I was people who were coming to Sydney to speak in political demonstrations and in advocacy for land, particularly. And a lot of those people were saying, well, look, if you want to do some research, there's a whole lot of old people up in our place, come and talk to them. And the social history that I'd been so interested in the Indian work, looking at history from below, looking at working people's history, women's history, everyday people's history. Those things had become so important to me, but I realised I could do them in Australia.
So back in those days, you were learning about Indian history, but was there much Aboriginal history going on at universities or in sort of high levels, high school?
No, there was none. There was none. There was absolutely none. There was my grandfather, my mother's father, had been one of those Australians who, from an Irish background, they had a very strong sense of Irishness and opposition to the British colonial structure. But they also had a very romantic view about Aboriginal people. So my grandfather had worked a lot in the country. He was he did telegraph connections and telephones and things. And he was interested in, he fished a lot. He fished with Aboriginal people. He got to know people in various places in the bush, and he used to write really pretty bad poetry, but poetry which was about Aboriginal people, and
Oh,
it was
really?
very much in the lamenting the passing of the noble savaged, and it was not the sort of political position that I would have taken, but it was a very strong sentimental
What
interest.
what year? When was this? Was this around Mary Gilmore sort of times
Oh, it's
when she
probably
was
a
writing?
little after. It was probably sort of 1920s, 1910s, 1920s, 1930s.
Okay.
So he would have been, as a young man, he would have been doing a lot of traveling in Western New South Wales. A lot of people worked in rural areas, and he would have been doing that. So
Because
he was much more, he was alert and aware to the idea of Aboriginal people as a romantic sense of precursors. They were the people, because he was Irish, he was not interested in seeing himself coming from Europe and from England. He wanted to have a nationalistic Australian perspective, and he particularly was interested in Aboriginal people as reflecting that, as symbolising that.
look, it's interesting you talk about that. You know, I mentioned Mary Gilmore and some research I was doing a few years ago. I sort of really encountered her for the first time, and her description, and then more recent, and that time, but more recently with Kay Langlow Parker's
Mm,
work.
mm.
And it's stuff that I think many people, well, Mary Gilmore's pretty well known, but the Langlow Parker stuff, and it's just so fascinating to read
Mm.
as a scientist myself, the descriptions of that, but also the sort of, look, I mean, and this is not my area, but some of the attitudes seemed to be remarkable for the time. I'm not sure about your grandfather, but it sort of seems to be counter some of the more sort of government based
Yeah. Look,
stuff that you get.
Katie Langlow Parker had a very close relationship with Ualii people. So people related to Gumalarai, a little bit to the west on the Narran River in that area. And she was a very serious observer of Ualii culture and language. And she was good friends with people there on the property. And so her work was extremely good. It was very emotionally informed, and it was very fine science, really. She was denigrated by the early anthropology establishment at the University of Sydney. Was very male dominated,
Mm-hmm.
and it was disinterested in amateur, those people whose knowledge was drawn from close observation, but who didn't have some sort of academic credentials. And Katie Langlow Parker was one of those. So she struggled to be recognised, but her work's marvellous.
Yeah, it is. It is. It is. Let's come back to you. So you've got this background in your family, it sounds like, of interested in history and Aboriginal people, and I can see it's hard to escape that. But the juxtaposition of medicine, sort of as a potential career with history, they just seems quite different. Having said that, I did a Bachelor of Arts myself, where I actually did my first year. I loved history too, and I did World War II history as a subject in first year, as well as chemistry and anthropology and biology, because science was so limited. This was at Monash University in the early 80s. Science was so limited, you could only do science subjects, but with an arts degree, you could do almost anything you wanted.
I've worked a lot with aquatic biologists, and I live with a doctor. One of my daughters is a doctor. I'm really interested in biology and in medicine still. I just had to make difficult choices in my training, but I really value engaging with scientific observers and researchers, and I think it's been extremely important in environmental history to be able to work with and to understand scientific research that's going on. I mean, we seem, I mean, I think the scientists with whom I've worked closely, people like Scott Nichols, who's worked in on the Murray-Darling Basin work, has been alert to the ways in which culture and politics and history shape the environment in which they work. And I've been really humbled by the importance of scientific work in understanding the historical processes that I'm looking at. So I think we need to work together.
Yeah, but it's interesting that you do say that, because I sort of had an epiphany with the historical ecology and environmental history thing. So the things that probably now, or it's probably going back 20 years now, but until then, I had this background in a bit of anthropology, but I went into the zoology area in a big way because I loved animals so much. But I found at the time that, so the early 2000s, I suppose, that there was a real antipathy from many scientists that I was working with towards history. And in fact, I mean, if I look around even now, there's not a lot of my colleagues in the freshwater field, especially, who really immerse themselves in the historical side of things. And it wasn't until I went and had this National Library Fellowship, Harold White Fellowship in 2005, as I think the probably only second environmental person there, and that the first one was Jane Roberts. I don't know whether they know Jane. She worked for CSIRO, and I'm not actually sure what she's up to at the moment, but she was looking at the Murray and I think the Darling River paddleboat, the maps. And I thought that was a brilliant sort of thing to look at. But it seems like that there's a lot of my contemporary sort of ecologist colleagues who don't see history as being particularly important. And I think in the literature now, you're getting more in the last probably 10 years or so, a lot of papers written from historical ecologists saying how important it is for conservation and management and the cultural side of things as well. But it's a relatively recent phenomenon, I think. What do you think?
Oh, look, I think it is fairly recent. There's been quite a lot of the idea of working in teams, multidisciplinary teams, has been around a long time in public history, in heritage assessment and analysis. But like some current team activities and research, it was very much about people contributing as sort of quite individualized professionals. So that in heritage management, often the team would be led by a heritage architect, and then you might have a historian, and you might have a number of other professional analysts, and our reports would be delivered separately, and then there would be an overall report done by the heritage architect. Now, in my view, if you're going to do transdisciplinary research as opposed to multidisciplinary research, what you need to be doing is working together to develop the research questions.
Yes.
And then you absolutely need to draw on the expertise that you've spent all this time developing in particular professions, but you are engaging as you go along in the ways in which you are teaching each other, you are doing each other's work, ideally, but you are also learning to understand the language and the goals and the intentions and expectations of your colleagues in other disciplines. And I think that's a great learning experience. And it's certainly been one of the most exciting parts of the work that I've done in really genuinely transdisciplinary work, like the Talking Fish Project, which was great.
How did you get involved with that Talking Fish project in the first place? With Jodie Frawley, wasn't it?
Yeah. And Scott Nichols.
Yeah, Scott Nichols. Yeah.
So I'd worked, my early work, as you've suggested, was in oral history work, was social history in the period sort of mid 20th century, early 20th century through to about the 1960s or 70s. And I had been working in oral history. I'd been interviewing Aboriginal people in various places, a lot of them on the Darling, not so many on the Murray, but mainly the North Coast and the Darling River. And I was working a lot with people on the freshwater rivers, the Barwon and the Namoy and those rivers. And from that process, I'd been really confronted constantly by the Aboriginal people with whom I was working with how important the environment was. It was important in terms of livelihoods, obviously. You drew your sustenance and your water and refreshment, but also you drew your knowledge and your philosophy and your relationships with other people through land and water. And so the issues about the quality and the health and protection of land and water were really big issues. And certainly for the people on the Darling River with whom I was working a lot, people say from Moree, Collarenebri down to Burke and down to Wilcannia, the issues about water being pumped out of the Murray-Darling, or out of the Darling network was really big, and people were really concerned about cotton. A lot of Aboriginal people had been working as cotton shippers. They'd been subjected to exposure to chemicals which they really were deeply concerned about. Some of them were certainly toxic, and they were concerned not only about their own health, but the health of the river, which involved not only the health of the fish and the mussels and the other creatures and the birds with whom on whom they depended, but also the quality, the spiritual health of the river was important. And if you lost water, or if the water was pumped out whenever there was rain further upstream, you lost those freshers, you lost that irregular nature of the river flow, which changed the way the river functioned for people culturally. And so the thinking about water particularly, but the landscape altogether, because many Aboriginal people in the areas I was working, by the time I got there, they had memories of working on camps on the big properties. But by the 1970s, when I was doing this work, all the big properties had been cut up. So the work camps were entirely dependent on the size of the property. So people had been able to, in those camps, they had been able to live on their own land, and they had had some access to their own country. But as those properties got cut up into smaller and smaller blocks, then the labour needs changed. There was more family labour used on these smaller properties, and Aboriginal people were increasingly turned off their own country. So the real dispossession in that area was happening in the 1950s and 60s. There had been terrible challenges earlier on, but there was this real dispossession going on then. And so the rivers had become doubly, triply important because they were the last pieces of people's country that they could live on. Because you can't colonize riverbanks. You know, they're muddy and they're rugged, and
and they get flooded every so often.
That's right. You just can't put a fence on them, but you can put a camp, and you can fish, and you can hang out on the riverbank, and that's what so many people did. Their knowledge of the waters and the rivers was really important. The creatures in the water, the birds, and the freshers. That irregular nature of the river flow.
But as you say, the people upstream could affect the river through the dams and pumping and things. So while you can't control the river bank, the actual river can be controlled. Were the people able to have any say in what happened with the water back in those days?
Well, nobody could. I'm talking about the 1960s and 70s.
Yeah.
Water had been made a commodity. It was saleable, and the cotton industries that were upstream, and I mean, cotton was just one. The intensive agribusiness essentially is this was a mode of intensively working land and pumping water. So high technology, and in fact, the cotton industry took notice of these environmental concerns much earlier than other industries did. And indeed, the grazing industry was pretty slow in thinking about the ways in which they thought they had the high moral ground because they weren't pumping so much water out. But in fact, you know, the toxicity of the chemicals they were putting into the water and the damage from overgrazing and the erosion and the exotic grasses, all of that was contributing to immense damage in the rivers. So the pressure on the rivers was all about private property. It was about these leaseholds, as they often were, being operated privately, and the townspeople, white townspeople, had no access to control them either. Only the owners of the property and the government regulators. Now, the Western Division had been created after the terrible overgrazing of the 1890s, the terrible drought, but it was only a very cautious regulator, because it was really believed by governments of all persuasions that if you had an industry, you should support it. So there was a lot of support for graziers and very little support for the environment or environmental flows. So my work in oral history with Aboriginal people had impressed on me that land and environment and water, crucially, was important. And I'd begun work on a project called the Black Soil Country, looking at the floodplain with Damien Lucas, who's a wonderful historian who did terrific work comparing coastal rivers with the rivers feeding into the Darling. And from there, I was invited to work on the Talking Fish project to look at our oral history of fishing people on the Murray-Darling rivers, the whole river system. And we were funded through the Murray-Darling Basin Commission, who thought that we would talk to the fishing clubs.
Oh, that's interesting.
Which we did. Our fishing clubs were wonderful. And there was great, interesting people there. But the work that I'd done made it very clear to me that there were Aboriginal people who understood an enormous amount about the river, who fished all the time, who wouldn't be caught dead in a fishing club, and who wouldn't be allowed in probably, but they certainly wouldn't go. But there were also white women who fished.
Yes.
Often when their children were young, they would often be teaching their children. Right through that period in remote areas with no schools or only school of the air, in order to teach children, you took them out onto your property and you took them to the creeks and you showed them how to fish, and you taught them biology by looking at what was in the creek. So there was a lot of people who weren't in fishing clubs. And that's the work that Jody and I did. But as I said, we worked really closely with Scott Nicol, and I learned a huge amount about the ecology of river systems, and we talked to hydrologists and we understood more about the flow. And with Jody, we did lots of really interesting interviewing, not only with Aboriginal people. We made sure that we had Aboriginal people. I mean, we, like a lot of researchers, we knew we didn't have too much money. We didn't have enough money to do the in-depth work we would have liked to have done. The decision was made by all of us as a team that we would look at the 12 reaches of the system where there'd already been a lot of scientific work done, so that we were looking at places where there was a lot of baseline work for us to work with. And we still realised that we could only do a baseline study in each place. We couldn't do an in-depth study that we would have liked to have done. And so we made sure that we had at least one Aboriginal person in each reach being interviewed, and we had at least one woman in each reach. And we achieved that in almost all of them, I think 11 out of 12. Sometimes we had more Aboriginal people, sometimes the women were Aboriginal, and sometimes they were non-Aboriginal. We had a Chinese Australian in one area. We had Indian Aboriginal interviewees in other areas. So we were recognising the complexity of the cultural mix along the river and the importance of different sorts of knowledges. And we were also recognising that there were conflicts
Mhm.
Some of these people had a very different view from each other about what was needed, what was going wrong, and how to fix it.
Yeah, look, it's you. I mean, you're saying that you didn't have a lot of money, as we often don't have a lot of money to do an in-depth study, but it is a wonderful piece of work, and it's a pretty voluminous in its entirety. So I was really impressed by that. I'd like to pick up on the women fishing side of things, because in my own historical research, it seems like that, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but um, male and female Aboriginal people tended to, they're both very involved with fishing in different ways. And at least my understanding in the Murray was that the women tended to fish for crayfish and for mussels and maybe smaller fish, and the men perhaps um, would fish on the larger fish, maybe the Murray cod, and diving and spearing and things. But I'm interested in the sort of the fact that white women fish as well, and a colleague of mine here at Charles State University, Katie Doyle, she and her partner are very keen fishers, and she also talks about fishing being very popular amongst women as well. I hadn't thought about the educational side of it, but that sort of makes sense. I wonder whether there's any sort of aspect of it which is that white women coming to the rivers and settling along those areas also observed, like Katie Langlow Parker did, that women were heavily involved with fishing as well, and saw it as something that they could be involved with, or whether it was just something completely separate.
I think, well, to start with, I'd say that with Aboriginal people fishing on those rivers, the air in the Darling, there's not, there's not too much space to decide what it is you're going to fish. And I mean, you can certainly make a decision about gathering mussels and or whether you're going to get birds and birds' eggs and things like that. The gender division about types of fishing and fishing technology was certainly much more evident on coastal rivers and in coastal areas, big areas like Port Jackson. You've got to keep in mind there's 200 years of colonisation going on in Western New South Wales that's often, in the early days, extremely violent and challenging. And as I said, Aboriginal people had often been pushed off the lands they owned and knew they owned, and the rivers were safe spaces. So when I was there in the 70s and 80s, women were fishing just like men. They were using lines, and they were enormously skillful. Both women, elderly women and elderly men, were doing a lot of fishing, and young people, men and women, were often off working on properties, particularly because there were few camps still in existence, big camps. Then you often had people having to travel a long way, either to work on properties as grazing properties or to do harvesting work. So you often, and young women were often working as housemaids in big properties, so that it meant that it was often the older members of the family who were looking after kids, and one way to do that was to take them to the river.
Mm-hmm.
So you often had grannies and granddads. You'd say grannies for both grandfathers and grandmothers, teaching kids about fishing and what was there and how to get them. And so this is, I mean, the 1970s is not the 1770s, but on the other hand, there are strands of knowledge. And when I was hanging out on the river bank and fishing with people, I would be hearing stories about, Auntie so-and-so who used to fish over on that point. And I'd also be hearing stories about the spiritual bodies, the legendary figures who were under the water and still alive and still active and able to make things happen. and maybe dangerous for young people if they stayed on the river at night. And so there's the mixture. And I was also hearing stories about what was good to eat, about mussels, for example, which very few non-Aboriginal people were interested in along the Darling when I was there. Mussels were a really big deal for Aboriginal people. Birds, eggs, all those sorts of things. I was learning lots of things about tucker, about plants and how you use them. But I was also learning about Auntie May, fishing up on that point over there. So there's a lot of different types of stories that are being told, and there's an absolute core into long knowledge and belonging to country. The river was a real tie of people's sense of belonging, and it gave people a sense of identity. So, I mean, the Ualii and Gumalarai people don't take the name of the landforms or the river as their language name or community name, but the Barkindji do. It's the people belong to the River Barker. They have other names which reflect their language structures. But so in that sense, that's the ways in which people were using the river and drawing on it had probably looked a lot different than they may have done 200 years before, but they were still connected. And yes, certain women, it was a woman who won the Burke fishing competition, in the 1990s, an Aboriginal woman, I might say, who won the fishing competition. Now, in terms of non-Aboriginal women, I think it varied. I think competitive sport, and if you look at the fishing magazines 20 years ago, they're very masculine.
Oh, yes.
There is an assumption that this is a masculine pastime, which made it difficult for women to take part, even if they wanted to.
I encountered in the last few months with some amazing ads from just the early 90s in those fishing magazines, which would make your hair curl nowadays.
That's right. So, but in fact, as in other places in the world, women might fish in more private spaces. They might not fish in the most public spaces where you've got blokes being blokes and sort of dominating in some sort of competitive and masculinized setting. So there were certainly women who fished for pleasure because they loved it. There were women who fished because it put food on the table for their kids. And there were women who fished in this period of time when their children were young for those sorts of reasons that I've mentioned, as a way to expand their kids' education when they were doing School of the Air and other sorts of distance education.
Yeah, no, really interesting. So you came from the coast. I mean, you grew up in Sydney, presumably, and then you've done some work inland, like you're talking about. There's also I read you've worked on 2 royal commissions, the British nuclear testing and the Black Deaths in custody. And so, did you find it? I mean, you obviously got enamored by the inland rivers and the culture and the environment there, but it's such a different environment, isn't it? Having grown up on the coast too, myself in Adelaide and Melbourne, coming to Albury and working in the Murray-Darling Basin was a bit of. I also was in Tasmania too, I suppose. Working in the Murray-Darling Basin was a bit of a shock at first, but I've grown to love the inland rivers, the river red gums, the nature of the land. I don't think there's anything I find more charismatic really than the river red gum. I think they're just the most amazing trees. But it is a shock when people first come to those sorts of areas from the coast, because it is such a different environment.
I think in the as a historian, in the period when my grandfather was working, being his telegraph person, a lot of city people worked over the Blue Mountains.
Yeah,
there was much more traveling. People did more seasonal work. There was much more traveling, and much more familiarity with rural areas. But my childhood was always, Christmas holidays were always on the coast. So we'd always go up and down the coast, stay in a camping area, and, you know, sleep in a tent and splash around in the water.
Mm.
So we had lots of sort of water oriented holidays. And my family's idea of a holiday was that you went to the beach and you did watery stuff. Going west of the Blue Mountains for me was different, and I found it quite quite different to have this big spread out floodplain, to be aware of the fact that that when it flooded, when the Darling flooded, it really spread out. I had a close friend who became a lawyer with the Aboriginal Legal Service at Brewarrina, and he was one of the first lawyers in the the mid 70s, and he covered the area from Walgett all the way down to Dayton, which, as you know, is
Yeah.
a big area.
Mm.
And when he was in Sydney at one stage, when there was a big flood on in the 70s, and he couldn't get back. He got as far as Nyngan, and that's where the floodplain came to. So there was a boat which came to get him, and he was eventually able to get back to Brewarrina. And the questions around how the various communities related. I mean, Aboriginal people were often, the Aboriginal Reserve was invariably on the low side of the river, so it got flooded first, but they weren't connected to the town water supply. So their running water was very limited. They had to go and carry water, but they would be subject to flooding very rapidly and all the disadvantages that that holds. So the politics of water in country towns was really important. The floodplain was very obvious. So all of that was new to me, although I'm learning a bit more about it on the coast now. But the real challenge for me was when my husband and I went to live in Central Australia. So the reason I got to be on the Royal Commission into British nuclear testing was because I was living in Ernabella, which is a settlement south. It's in South Australia. It's in the Musgrave Ranges, 6 hours drive from Alice Springs. So you come straight down to Eldunda, and then you head west, and then you come down to Ernabella, and it's now Pukacha on the Pitjantjatjara freehold lands. And that was it's an arid zone area, but quite diverse in lots of ways. And because the Musgraves are sort of low, rounded hills, there was water holes. Water was even more important. It was more precious. People were aware of dew. They were aware of underground water flowing. It made water much more visible to me in a way, even than it had in rural New South Wales. So it's been, in many ways, there are that Central Australian area is very different to what we know as rural and regional areas in the eastern states or around the southwest. It's challenging, and it's a very different type of environment that I was learning and being taught about. I was really lucky to have great teachers out there. So
yeah. I wanted to ask you if I sort of segue into something a little bit different. You co-authored a.
So you may not be able to see me just for a second. Just hang on 1 minute. I'm trying to turn my Gmail off, which may stop that terrible noise. Okay. Yes.
I can still see you. You're in a lot of the work you've done. Some of the work you've done, you've collaborated with Aboriginal people on various projects, and you're sort of talking about doing proper transdisciplinary projects. And one of the standouts clearly is the work the book that you co-authored with Isabel Flick. And I was reading a little bit about her, and I confess to my shame that I didn't know much about her. Tell me about what she was all about. Tell us all about what Isabel Flick was all about, and how you got involved with her. Because did you first meet her at Tranby? Is that where you met her?
No, I met Isabel because when Isabel came to Sydney with her family to get away from the racism in Collarenebri, which is where she belonged, or it's where she came from. Her family had actually come from a bit further north than there. They lived in Collarenebri. She hadn't been allowed to go to school because she was too black. There had been no black kids were allowed to go to the school when she was a kid. And after the Second World War, things were just as bad in Collarenebri. So she came to the city with her family to escape that racism. And she worked in the hospital at Prince Alfred Hospital, which is where my husband was a medical student. And he met her there.
Okay.
And Isabel and my husband, Paul Torzillo, were involved with the early days of the Aboriginal Medical Service. So Paul got to know Isabel, and then I got to know Isabel, and I got to know her family. Her niece, particularly Barbara, was involved in the nursing profession, and another niece, Karen, and I became really close collaborators in a number of projects. And I've continued to be close to all of that family, and to Isabel's brother, Joe, married Isabel Walford. And so, and they had spent, they come from Angledool, which is on the Narran River, and been taken to Brewarrina station. And so all the people I had connections with were sort of connected with those three places: Collarenebri, Angledool, and Brewarrina station, and then the areas around. So I spent quite a bit of time with Isabel over the years, and she went back to Collarenebri after a while, and I was involved as friends with Barbara and Karen and other members of the family, and I kept in touch with them. I interviewed them for different projects. And Kevin Cook, actually, at Tranby, Kevin used to get Isabel to come and teach and play cards with the kids. We've got some great photographs of her playing cards with the students, in which opportunities she'd have to chat to people and get to know them, and they'd get to know her. And then she was teaching about history and issues around Aboriginal politics. And I spent quite a bit of time with her there. Kevin Cook organised some funding for her to do a life story, and she asked me if I'd help her with it.
It sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, that when she did go back to Collarenebri, things had changed somewhat in terms of attitudes towards Aboriginal people. I don't know, but my reading is that she was looked at in quite a different light, and her thoughts on the treatment of Aboriginal people and their rights and things was quite different by the time she returned. Is that correct?
No, I wouldn't say so.
Okay.
She had certainly had to, I mean, in terms of from the time of her youth, when she wasn't allowed into the school, which made her angry the rest of her life. And she could see that her children were allowed into the schools. The schools had been technically desegregated, but they were getting a very poor education. They were being marginalised and put into special classes. And when I mean, she'd certainly had to fight and struggle to get her kids into school and to get them recognised, but she found there were still many battles to fight when she went back home. She went back home because her children were old enough, they were past school age and they were getting work, and some of them were working in rural areas. And when she went back home, there was the Land Rights Act had just been established, and so there was a lot of advocacy which needed doing to speak up about either making land claims or identifying land which was claimable. And Isabel was particularly concerned with the cemetery, the Aboriginal cemetery. And so she would say, and in fact, it was my observation, that she had lots of battles that she had to fight just to get any sort of concession. Aboriginal people were still living in the camp. They still didn't have any running water. They still had to struggle to get access to medical care in the hospital. There was one doctor, Archie Kalakarinos, who would make it an effort to see Aboriginal people as patients. Other doctors, were very reluctant to even see Aboriginal people as patients. Aboriginal women, even when I was going up there, were still being forced to have their babies on the veranda of the hospital. They weren't being taken into the wards. I mean, this is racism in Western New South Wales was alive and well in the 1970s, which is why the Aboriginal Legal Service was needed, and people like Isabel. Isabel had, by that time though, both in her early years in Coloranabray and in Sydney, had become more confident about speaking up. And so she was prepared to stand up and speak up, even though that might lead to criticism and conflict. And one of the issues was this cemetery, I might say, was a segregated cemetery. It was a cemetery for Aboriginal people because Aboriginal people hadn't been allowed to be buried in the white cemetery for all the time when Isabel was young. So they had set up their own cemetery, which was a marvelous place. It was a place where people would, a place where graves were decorated because people didn't have much money. They would decorate graves with crazed glass. So in the days when you used to get coloured bottles, you burn the bottles, you make them very hot, and then you plunge them into cold water and they craze.
Right.
And then you break them into small pieces like that. And then you put those on top of the grave and you pack the black soil around, and when it rains, it becomes very hard. It's a very hard surface, but it's beautiful. You know, it glistens in the sun. It's lovely.
Wow.
So regularly, but of course, when it rains, you know, or it floods, you know, this gets washed away. So quite regularly, families would go to the cemetery, burn bottles. They'd set a little fire. They'd burn their bottles. They'd have a big bucket, put the bottles in the water, and craze them and decorate the graves. Sometimes there might be a little child's toy or something. But I've written about this. It was so extraordinary to see the way people would choose to bury the ones they loved if they had a choice. So that where there was a number of little tiny graves around a larger grave, and they were the graves of children who died, and they were around the grave of a granny, an older lady, so she could look after them.
Oh, it's beautiful.
It really was. It was lovely. But each, so regularly, every few months, every 6 months, families would go up there and they'd be burning bottles. So it was work. You did it all day. You'd take your lunch and you'd eat a bit of food up there and you'd tell stories. This was where children learned about why so-and-so was buried here and where Uncle so-and-so was buried and why he was buried up this way and who those people were whose graves were on the edge of the graveyard. And all of those stories about people's lives as well as their relationships would all be learnt in that process. So the cemetery was really important, and it continues to be important to this day. And the road was unsealed. So whenever it rained, you couldn't get out there. You couldn't bury people. You couldn't, you couldn't dig there. You couldn't have a funeral there because you couldn't get there. So one of the battles Isabel had when she first went back was to try and get that road sealed or made into an all-weather road, in any case, with gravel on it. So that was a really big battle that kept on going and was taken, it was regarded with hostility and disinterest by the townspeople. However, after a while, and hopefully by the end of the book, it became clear that Coloranabray, which had seen itself as a white township with Aboriginal people who were sort of pushed to the side, realised that it was in fact confronted with much bigger forces, and this was the big cotton farms and the industrial agriculture that was sucking the water out of the river, that was making it harder and harder for people in Coloranabray to find work and to keep a reasonable lifestyle going. And they really needed somebody to talk up for the river and the conditions of the health of the environment at Coloranabray. So who did they turn to? Isabel. Because she was brave, she'd learnt. She wasn't brave as a kid.
Did you find, was she resentful about that turn of events?
No, she was, she laughed about it. She laughed about it. She was awarded an OAM in the later years of her life, and she thought that was quite nice, but it was obviously quite a lot of non-Aboriginal people as well as Aboriginal people who'd recognised her work. But she used to say it stood for Old Aboriginal Mole. She used to joke about it, but she understood that. I mean, she had seen much before the white people in Colour Enterprise saw how little power they had. So she understood the politics of the state, and she understood the industrial situation and the capital issues around big properties and industrialized agriculture, and she understood those much better than the local white people, even than some of the elite graziers and others. She had she'd read, she'd talked to people, she had a recognition of the pressures that were on the environment up there, and she was happy to talk about it. She was happy to take that role on. She was amused, certainly.
And more recently, oh well, in the last maybe decade or two, you've also been doing some research with Indian people, I think. Is that research based in India itself? Do you see a lot of similarities or crossovers between the work that you've done in Australia and India in any particular ways? I mean, it seems like the environment and water and culture seem sort of ongoing themes in your research.
Well, actually, that's not how I got there.
Right.
It is. I did go to a few, and I continue to be in touch with environmental historians in India, Indian environmental historians, and they're wonderful. They're doing very exciting work, and I've been really grateful for the insights that I've got from them. They're really serious and very dedicated academics as well as activists. So I've got one colleague, Kartik Shankar, who's a professor at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, who's a turtle researcher who grew up, looking after baby turtles on the beaches in Tamil Nadu, and has continued and pursued that in his biological work, his ecological work. I've got others, Professor Mahesh Rangarajan, for example, who's a historian, who has, who I think really drew on his love. So many Indians are fascinated by birds. There's a really active interest in bird life and interest in protecting environments and habitats for birds. And Mahesh drew on that, I think, but has also worked very actively across a number of fields of environmental history. So that's been important. But the way that I got into working actively in Indian research was all these Aboriginal families that I know. Many of them have got Indian forebears, like not, like grandfathers and uncles.
All right.
They're people who, all the Fernandos and the Cruzes and all those people, they're people whose uncles or grandfathers or great grandfathers were sailors. They were lascars, and some people in Western New South Wales are descended from people who came trading camels or being hawkers. People in Eastern New South Wales, and I mean Colour Enterprise and Walgett and Burke even, are people whose forebears were both Aboriginal on a number of sides, and also there's an Indian there as well who was so there's somebody from a boat who was a lascar who jumped ship and who came inland and who married into the Aboriginal community. Now, Aboriginal family history conserves those stories, and there are some Aboriginal activists who have taken up this story and pursued their Indian families. They've gone back to India and they've found their Indian families. So it's actually quite an extent. In fact, there's a number of Indian Aboriginal activists on the in the Lower Darling area, and the Lower Darling Murray area into South Australia. So it's this sort of connection that led me into it and led me to just ask around at the National Library and the Noel Butlin Archive of Business and Labour. And it turned out that there's a whole union called the Indian Seamen's Union in Australia. Nobody had looked at the files. They're all the membership papers and a whole lot of correspondence. They'd been somehow ended up in the waterside workers office in Wollongong, and somebody, Rowan Carl, actually had the presence of mind to suggest that it goes to the Noel Butlin archive, but there it had sat. Nobody had looked at it.
Wow.
Until I went looking, and it became apparent that I don't know whether you've seen the film Indonesia Calling.
No.
But the whole very active political movement to support Indonesian independence in 1945, 46, 47 was as much on the basis of Indian seamen in Australia as it was on the basis of there were some Indonesians in Australia and Australian waterside workers and seamen. So it was a really extraordinary combination of unionists.
Wow.
But of a number of different backgrounds. The Indian seamen weren't covered in Australian waters. Many of them were members of the union in India, but they weren't covered in Australian waters. So they set up a union themselves, the Indian Seamen's Union in Australia.
Right.
And it's those records that I've looked at. So the book Beyond Borders looks at that, and it looks at the British used Indian troops in Indonesia to, in fact, enforce their support for the Dutch to return to become colonisers again after the Second World War, which failed. But the British were using Indian troops to do that. And the tensions, obviously, there were many defections, and people crossed the lines to fight with the Indonesian nationalists. And so there's amazing stories. So in Australia, you've got Indian Lascars who are working to and boycotting shipping, refusing to man ships in order to support Indonesian independence. And in Indonesia, you've got Indian troops being used against Indian nationalists, often reluctantly and often by defecting and crossing the lines. So all of that's happening in the space of 2 or 3 years at the same time. There's a bit of communication going on between the groups. So that's what that book's about. But it arose because of this relationship with Aboriginal people.
Well, that's fascinating. I know that we've got in Albury, where I live, there's some Indian. There were people from India who'd come out to, I think build fences. I'm not sure, or work. I'm not. Dirk Spenneman, who's a sort of historian archaeologist here, he's talked about it. There was an Indian cemetery which is now a soccer ground in the middle of Albury, and somebody in their infinite wisdom decided to sort of commemorate the Indian presence in Albury by naming some of the nearby streets with Indian names. But unfortunately, they didn't quite work out the difference between North American and other types of people, because they've called them Cheyenne. There's Cheyenne and Sioux Street and things like that, which is terribly embarrassing. Yeah. But it's not that surprising, really.
No, it's really interesting stories, and there's a vast array of them. There's a really good book by Samia Khatun, and it's called Australia Nama. Nama is an ending meaning story. So this book is called The Story of Australia. The story about Australia, and it's by Samia Khatun, Khatun, who's a good friend of my daughter.
Yeah.
And who's now living in London, but has been teaching in Bangladesh, which is where her family came from. But there are extraordinary stories once you really start looking into the stories about people who came prior to the White Australia Act. There's a lot of people who stayed for various reasons, and then there's all these people who came and married into the Aboriginal community.
Well, I gather from what Dirk was saying is that quite a lot of the Indian workers here, uh, I think if they'd gone back to India, they couldn't return and they couldn't bring family members to Australia, so they were in a bit of a bind. I On a sort of slightly different note, but you're talking about the Indian environmental historians and environment. And I had a PhD student who was from India, and she went back after she finished her PhD, and she found it a very challenging environmental sort of working in the environmental area in India because of the very dense populations and a lot of the environmental issues they had there. But very, very strong support, but a very challenging environment.
Yeah, there's a lot of, well, India is really diverse. You know, the regional differences in India are extraordinary. And in urban areas where you've got mega cities in a number of places, there's a whole lot of questions about cities and poverty, and then on the other hand, you've got Rajasthan with massive deserts, and you've got you've got biodiverse areas if you look at the Western Ghats. So you have really very diverse areas and issues around environmental history and in the ways in which British colonialism shaped uses of the environment in different places, the way Mughal presence had shaped uses of environment. There's a lot of really fascinating things there, and there's a lot of very important, as I said, really extraordinary, interesting work done by Indian environmental scientists and historians, and in fact a lot of Indian sociologists are in fact doing oral history, even though they don't call it oral history, they call it ethnography or something, but they don't really recognize that there's a lot of synergies. So there's quite a lot of ways in which an oral historian like me, who uses memory a lot as a methodology and a resource and is interested in the environment, there's a lot of people that I can relate to there, not only environmental historians. So it's been a very exciting place to be in touch. There's a lot of great activists and a lot of important work going on, and I continue to be involved in that. But it's a bit hard now with the COVID lockdown.
Yeah.
My current work, as you know, is about saltwater. And
Yes. I was going to ask you about that because we've been talking, would you believe, for almost an hour now, and I wanted to ask you about your current research. So, can you tell us a little bit about what you're currently doing?
what am I doing? Well, I got into this because I've got a colleague who's an archaeologist, and he was interested in looking at environments which are understood in different ways, the one environment in different ways by culturally diverse people. And he was interested in places with dense populations in Australia. And I was interested in working on the Georges River, where I come from Saltpan Creek, in fact, in Padstow near Bankstown. So I teamed up with him, and we looked at, he was working with National Parks and Wildlife, and we looked at the Georges River National Park, and we traced the ways in which different cultural groups understood that place and the way they valued it. So rather than the idea that environments have intrinsic meanings or values, we were looking at culturally diverse groups engaging with the same landscapes but building different bodies of knowledge. And so it's very much there's a strong strand of geographic thinking that's built this sort of idea of the importance of understanding the cultural and social dimensions of environmental relationships. And so we worked largely on the Georges River National Park. We worked with Aboriginal people, we worked with Vietnamese Australians, with Arabic speakers, predominantly Sunni Muslim groups in that area, but also Mandaeans all of whom spoke Arabic, but Mandaeans are a group, they're Abrahamic religious group who follow John the Baptist.
Right.
So they're interested in full body immersion, baptism frequently, not just at birth.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so you can't really do that in the Georges River. It's pretty. So issues about water quality are very important. A lot of Mandaeans who come from Iraq, they're originally from Palestine, but they had been pushed over centuries. And there were many in Iraq, and they were persecuted under Saddam Hussein. And many came to Australia, and they were living around Liverpool area on the Georges River. But because the Georges River is not really very suitable for full body immersion, they developed a site at Penrith on the river there, where the water was it was fresh and it was flowing better, and it was more suitable to the frequent immersion that's involved in Mandaean baptism. So we worked both with Sunni Muslims and with Mandaeans, and we also worked with Anglo-Irish, in fact, Australians. Bankstown used to be called Irish Town.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were working with people who lived along the river who saw their roots as being in the United Kingdom. We wrote about, Alison Cadzow and I wrote Rivers and Resilience, about the Aboriginal presence on the river.
Mm-hmm.
We wrote 2 books which are online with Vietnamese Australians, Waterborne and Waters of Belonging, with Arabic speakers. But we never really got to write the book with Anglo-Celtic Australians. So I've just done that. The book's called Georges River Blues, and it's with the publishers. It'll come out with ANU Press later in the year. And it's about the environmental, the resident action campaigns in the 70s and 80s, 60s, 70s and 80s, from sort of Little Saltpan Creek down to Botany Bay. And I've been thinking a lot. I mean, for a long time, since I've grown up, I've been thinking about salt water and mangroves and toxic pollution and battery factories, and the ways in which what I regarded as a child as a heavily polluted and pretty unsavory place has in fact been rescued by the work of so many resident action campaigners and people who've really put a lot into trying to protect the river. At the same time as, I mean, often they were confronting local governments who were trying to reclaim, as they called it, fill in lowlands. The term wetlands wasn't really used even for 10 years after it was being used elsewhere. So in the 1970s, people talked about swamps and marshes, and councils were organising reclamation projects and building playing fields. But we interviewed some council health inspectors, and in fact, they were desperate about the garbage explosion. There was a massive increase in packaging after the Second World War, with the changing economy, changing purchasing, and the nature of the packaging industry really expanded. And there was just massive amounts of garbage. And as one of the health inspectors at Bankstown said to me, it wasn't like we just wanted to dig out a few more mangroves. We didn't have any idea what to do with this garbage. And so the councils were really struggling as well. There was this issue of changing economies, as well as the expansion of factories into flat areas for process work. And there was a lot of toxic stuff going into the river from battery factories and other things in the top of Saltpan Creek. So there was a lot of problems with the river, and it's really been these resident action groups that have saved it. And the Georges River now is a much better, healthier place. The sharks have come back.
Wow, oh, fantastic.
Which is not something that, local swimmers would be all that pleased about, but at least it means the river's healthier than it was.
Have you ever been an angler, a fisher yourself?
No, I actually, well, there's pictures of me fishing on the Darling River. I mean, on the Barwon. I've spent a lot of time hanging out with people while they fished, and I put in lines and things on the Darling. I'm not an angler I eat saltwater fish, and it took me a while to get used to freshwater fish inland. But the only places I've ever actually fished much have been the inland rivers. So I might have caught freshwater fish, but I wasn't, I don't like killing fish. So I'm a bit.
Yeah, look, I mean, I used to go fishing when I was younger with a friend who was very keen fisher, and he still is. But it was, for me, it was being around rivers, which was sort of more the interesting things. I don't think I have the patience really to sit and wait for something, a fish to bite my hook. But it was just being out there amongst it, which was.
Well, this was what we found with Aboriginal people in Western New South Wales. People were able to sit for a long time waiting for a bite because they were telling stories. So riversides and river fishing and grannies with their kids is all about telling stories. So you teach kids about place names and places and stories about Auntie May and stories about the, Gadicha who live under the water, I mean, these are the ways in which people learn. It's like going to the cemetery at Coleraine O'Brien, learning about the people who are buried there and why they're buried in the way they are. You tell stories, and that role of cultural transmission and education is really important.
Yeah. Look, it's been fascinating, and we could talk for a lot longer, but we probably shouldn't. Otherwise, I don't know. We'll probably never stop. But it's been fascinating talking to you about all this. And what's the next project that are you still doing the Georges River work?
Yeah. Look, there's two things. One of the things I want to do is I've been working with Vandana Ram, who's the director of the Bankstown Culture Centre. And we're interested in the Biennale next year. The theme is subterranean. And I'm interested in looking at the catchment of Saltpan Creek. So if you think about the way water flows from the ridges, which is north of the railway station, in their underground drains, it's not regarded as part of the watercourse, but it's the way the water flows. It comes down and then it comes into Saltpan Creek and eventually comes into the river. Now, as I understand it, I've been trying to find when the name Saltpan Creek emerged, and a lot of people assume that it's about panning for salt and making it's much more likely to have been about the number of wetlands that were on the creek. Salt pan was an early name for scalded salt flats and saline marsh areas. And there's quite a few of those which were along that area. And there's early examples of conflict, Tedbury, for example, conflict over land and early settlement. And then there's a very interesting story about a lot of families living on Saltpan Creek in the 30s and 40s that I've written about in some of the work I've done in Rivers and Resilience particularly. But if you look at climate change and the way in which that is shaping the way Saltpan Creek catchment works, you find that the areas what climate change is affecting this area in the middle of the city with increased flooding. And that increased flooding is affecting the low-lying areas which were turned into factories.
Right.
In which were working the immigrant groups who were brought in as migrant labourers. So questions around migration, population change, and the ways in which economic change is being affected by climate change make a lot of sense. So if we look at this whole catchment, we can see these stories of colonialism, stories of protest and challenge, changing with the expansion of the economy after World War II, and now the impact of climate change. So that's the...
Yeah, okay. Look, I'm amazed how you can get your head around all of that, but you've obviously done it many times before, and I look forward to seeing the results of that research and that writing. So thanks very much for talking. Yeah, it's been a real pleasure to hear about all the work you've done, and I think an inspiration for the as I said, the ability to bring all those sort of threads together and tell stories about it. So thanks very much, and we'll see you around.
Thank you. Yes, lovely to talk. It's really good to think about all this stuff. So
great.
And I might just to finish to say how important it's been to be able to work with people whose knowledge base is science research. It's just been crucial.
Well, it's nice to hear you say that, and that interaction, the interflow of ideas and stuff is we need more of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We all need it.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you very much.